Welcome to the second talk in the Exchanges programme series entitled Exploring Socially Engaged Arts Practice. Exchanges is a programme of talks, workshops and residencies from Sligo County Council Arts Service funded by the Arts Council's Invitation to Collaboration scheme. The programme focuses on developing supports for artists from culturally diverse backgrounds and is aimed at providing funding for artists at all stages of their career who are interested in working in culturally diverse and socially engaged contexts. The Exchanges programme is presented in partnership with CREATE, the National Development Agency for Collaborative Arts, Carja Sligo Arts Festival, the Model Sligo and the Hawkswell Theatre. So thank you to Sligo County Council Arts Office and CREATE for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm Zoë O'Reilly. I'm a researcher focusing on migration, asylum and cultural diversity and currently based at UCD. Today, I'm delighted to be in conversation with 4 artists who all work in very different ways and with different artistic media, but who have in common a socially engaged and collaborative practice, working closely with people and communities. So I would like to introduce you to Jijo Sebastian, Emily Waszak, Tobi Balogun and William Bock. The aim of today's conversation is to provide space for each artist to introduce and explain a bit about their work, and to have a conversation about what supports they have accessed in order to carry out and develop their practice in Ireland, what challenges they've faced, and how they've overcome or worked through these challenges. We hope that today's talk will provide a useful resource, in particular for early career artists working in a socially engaged context. So each artist will give us a short presentation of their work, and then we'll have a few minutes for discussion after that. So we'll start with Jijo. Jijo Sebastian is a migrant collaborative filmmaker with more than a decade of experience in participatory, collaborative and intercultural filmmaking in a community-based context. He's a recipient of the 2015 Artist in the Community Award, 2016 Next Generation Bursary Award, and 2020 Arts Participation Bursary from the Arts Council of Ireland. Jijo has written, directed and post-produced 7 short films and 1 feature-length telefilm, collaborating with groups, families and individuals from the Keralite Indian community in Ireland. Selected films have been screened at international film festivals, and Jijo was the winner of Best Film and Best Director Award at Focana Film Festival, Illinois, USA. Jijo's practice and films find coherence in their shared immigrant-oriented themes, participatory methodologies, and suburban Dublin geographical context. I will hand over to you, Jijo.
Now, I'll try to give a general idea about my practice, its context and methodology, along with a brief description of the project Bock. I'll be showing slides of film posters, some video clips during the presentation to give you an idea about the films. I have lived in Ireland since 2006, and over the last 13 years, I have made 8 short films. I just finished 1 more, so I've made 8 short films and 1 telefilm along with participants and collaborators, mostly from my own community, who are people from a state called Kerala in South India. Following the tradition of ethnic filmmakers in Europe in themes and subject matter and utilizing participatory practice of community filmmaking, while collaborating creatively in a similar way to socially engaged art practice methods, I have developed a unique practice situated at the intersection of collaborative, participatory, and no-budget production modes. My practice in its initial stages was mostly informed and inspired by a Keralite left activist filmmaker John Abraham's production strategies. John Abraham pioneered one of the first movements in India to bring together film enthusiasts and radically transform film funding and distribution methods. Our projects followed his marginality in aesthetics and participatory production modes to an extent, including non-professional actors, non-commercial dissemination, crowdfunding, etc. We as a group with strong socialist ethos, organized around a film society named IRIS, naturally fell into the participatory/collaborative community filmmaking mode. Our projects across the funded and non-funded, unicultural and intercultural, participatory and collaborative ventures find coherence in their shared immigrant family-oriented themes, pedagogical participatory methodologies, suburban Dublin geographical context, and relational dynamics in process of production. Films were disseminated through social media, film festivals, private and public screenings, and discursive events. I'm going to show a small teaser of one of the films. It's only 1 minute long.
I, your father. You my son. I too much loving you. I see your wife in another man car 3 times. I telling you for your good. Slowly ask your wife. I think external affair. I, your father.
All the projects are critically immersed within a DIY filming sensibility combining affordable digital technologies. The structure, norms, values, and language of the film industry are decontextualized to generate our own processes in a power-critical, democratic context. The production and public dissemination practices acted as counterpoints to traditional media. Practical wisdom gained from the interplay of diverse individuals and situations help power our traditional hierarchical structure and fixed frameworks. Along with the participatory action research model of collective investigation and knowledge production, resource and knowledge inventory, pooling of locations and resources, developing secondary skill sets to keep the crew to the minimum, are some of the budget filmmaking methods we use in our projects. Contained within these autodidactic production strategies, we as a marginal minority remained invisible to and unaware of the funding institutions and academic artistic communities in Ireland for many years. The key concern that underpin my practice and thematic is the complex nature of an immigrant identity, the variables that mediates its formation and its trajectory of transitioning. Our identities, influenced by our colonial and post-colonial history, mediated by class, caste, religion, gender, age, education status, cultural and social capital, language skills, etc., are renegotiated on an everyday basis. Befitting this shifting sense of self, my practice borrows from and identifies with many filmmaking practices from art house to community filmmaking, including third cinema, intercultural, amateur, ethno, and accented cinema, with influences from practices of docufiction and radical film culture. Portrayal or questioning of identity in every project is influenced by my own transient personal identifications with particular aesthetics and political positions are developed in response to my exposure to niche filmmakers, authors, and art practices I encountered in my research and development as a filmmaker. Partly framed by my own values and identity, the film text becomes performative and reflexive. Simultaneously concerned with the moral discourse around ethnic minority issues and critical conversations on immigrant integration in a transcultural framework, my practice connects the personal to the cultural by problematizing issues around my lived experience as an immigrant, attempting to come to terms with a transcultural identity. In general, my practice can be described partly as curating my own response to the subjective experiences I have with people I interact with in the collaboration process. Typically, collaborators are identified and their personality, life experiences, and socio-cultural environment investigated to constitute an information system from which characters, scenes, and a script is derived. The films, mostly docufictions where people often played themselves, saved as repositories of personal memory and records of places. While adding to the peripheral histories of the nation, our activities were also an attempt to make sense of our alienation and harbor mental well-being. The film functions as a community inquiry process and body of evidence of memorialization. Our practice, seen as symbolic activity denoting a social change initiative, also becomes a site of dissent by disrupting industry norms, thus carrying over Kerala leftist political lineage into our lives in Ireland. Our project in general, in a way, can be framed as, open quote, friends getting together, doing the thing they love as part of the invisible real history of cinema, end quote, as per the definition of amateur cinema by Jonas Mekas. Jonas Mekas he recently passed away. He's one of the most famous amateur filmmakers in the world. It was a result of a requirement for emotional connectivity we felt. Our sudden translocation and the postmodern living in the West deprived us of. As global South immigrants in the seemingly alien modern West, our insecurities brought us into communicative acts like filmmaking to rebalance our lives by the restoration of the social bond through a collective elaboration of meaning. Consider us as people weaving a meta-narrative of small, local, and cooperative against the large, global, and competitive, seeking a politics that permits questioning and redistribution of identities. These activities manifested our transactional subjectivity through dialogue, community, collaboration, and self-expression. Bock is a short film made in collaboration with Neuron, a Malayali or a Keralite community of left-wing rationalists in Ireland. It was supported by Arts Council Ireland through Artists and Community Scheme, managed by Create Ireland. Bock explores religious extremism, racial and religious prejudice, social freedom in insular minority communities, and feminism, among many other things, in an Irish intercultural context. The project duration was 1 year, with 32 collaborators in total and a budget of €10,000. With a vision to practice socially engaged art as an opportunity for a community to express itself, the process of collaboration in the film was extensively studied and experienced by myself and the community in the production, where 5 different nationalities took part. The community was engaged in every stages of the production via filmmaking and acting workshops, online and offline story building, etc. The short film investigates cultural diversity and action in public spaces, focusing on events in a suburban pub. The story revolves around the main character's own real-life experiences living as a Pentecostal church member. Neuron's strong commitments to its rationalistic ideologies shaped the concept of the film, thus pitting the film against mainstream religious and insular culture of the Indian Keralite diaspora in Ireland. With its left-wing ideology of grassroots participation, the group found the do-it-together approach of socially engaged filmmaking very appealing. The project afforded the participants an opportunity to develop their visual media literacy by way of involving the participants as production technicians. The politics of ideology has given way to the politics of religious, racial, and ethnic identities in the new millennium, partly due to the poor integration of recent immigrants. Bock is a response from a left-leaning neuron to the new super-diversity in European societies and the backlash of nationalistic populism, carrying strong implications for the ways in which new identities and notions of belonging are being redefined. I will show you a trailer of Bock.
The point is, when they say, you're going to stick to what you are, your culture, your custom, and the like, what they're telling you is, you should stick to yourself, keep your culture, and keep away. Put you in a box.
Jenny had a bad dream last night. I don't even want to talk about it. It was brown man and a bomb explosion in it.
Lastly, I would like to take a small peek at my current project called Color of My Breath, where I collaborate with 5 ethnically and otherwise diverse artists in Ireland to produce a short documentary on the subject of integration. The artists are Alessandra Savado, an Afro-Brazilian dancer, Hina Khan, a Pakistani visual artist, Amir Abu Al-Rob, a Palestinian theatre maker, Mark Sabata, a Zimbabwean musician, and Thomas Madajcek, Polish visual artist. The 6-month-long project has come to an end, which mostly happened online due to COVID, and we were lucky enough to film in person as the restrictions eased. The project is supported by Arts Council, commissioned by CREATE, the National Agency for Collaborative Arts, and funded by the Communities Integration Fund from the Department of Children, Equalities, Disability, Integration, and Youth. I will show a few skills. That's Alessandra, that's Thomas, and that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
That was great. Really good to see it. Yeah, thank you. We'll turn now to Emily. So Emily Waszak is a Dublin-based textile artist whose work currently focuses on ritual, collective grief, and how objects are imbued with meaning. Emily's work is also concerned with themes of racial capitalism, migration, and social reproduction. Emily is a member of the Angelica Network and a recent recipient of the Irish Arts Council's Visual Arts Bursary and the Artist in the Community Research and Development Award with CREATE. I'll hand over to you, Emily.
Thank you very much. This is just some of my thoughts about socially engaged art practice, specifically my own practice. So what we talk about when we talk about socially engaged art, I think we talk about a lot of different things. So I'm just going to focus this presentation on my own practice. And so we think a lot about like the processes by which art is made. And then it's more sort of about the processes and engagement with people than maybe the material outcome. And sometimes there's no material outcome, and that's all right. Also, the themes of social justice, politics, community identity, etc. Those are kind of usually present in socially engaged art. And then I've highlighted the trap of performing identity because I think that this is something that people who are sort of othered in Ireland often find ourselves dealing with. And it's that we're expected to make socially engaged art specifically about our identities and perform, you know, this identity, whereas in other places we might not be expected to do the same. And, you know, white settled Irish artists aren't necessarily expected to do the same. So yeah, this is something that I often think about in terms of socially engaged art, specifically my practice. Let's see. Socially engaged art versus organizing or activism. This is important to me as well, mostly because I also do political organizing. And for me, they're two different things. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. And I do believe that one can lead to another. Like you can start a socially engaged art practice or an art project, and then that community continues to be politicized and then starts working in the context of a larger strategic social movement. I think that that often happens, but I think that for me, they're two separate things. And also, I think it's important because that they not be conflated, because sometimes art is for art, right? It doesn't have to have perfect politics, and political engagement, creative actions don't necessarily have to be good art either. And so I think that sometimes when we conflate the two, either the art suffers or the politics suffer. And is the distinction meaningful? For some people, it's not meaningful, but for me personally, it is meaningful. So yeah. Again, collaborative versus collective versus participatory. These are things that I think about all the time. Collaborative to me just means working with any other people, and that can be in a lot of different ways, right? It can be working with one person. It can be asking someone else to come in for a specific part of the project, or it can be sort of like equal, collective. But a collective is not necessarily, or a collaborative process is not necessarily a collective process. To me, collective means that you're working in a group and there's kind of horizontal decision making. Again, like as an anarchist, I feel like this is a really important distinction that I think needs to be made in my practice. And participatory, the audience participates, and not all collaborative work is participatory in terms of an audience participation. But yeah, when I think about projects, I often take these things into consideration. I also want to think about power dynamics. What does it look like to work in communities? Especially this inside-outside. I only work in communities that I'm a member of because that's how I feel comfortable. I don't really feel comfortable with outsider dynamics. There's a power that exists when an artist goes into a community that they're not a part of. And I think that that's okay as long as it's acknowledged and there is a discussion about it and it's part of the project. I also think a lot about the community as a subject. Being from a minority background and being involved in like different groups that are made of ethnic minorities, we often get approached by artists and researchers and academics, journalists to be the subject of like research. And that doesn't feel very good a lot of times. It feels very disempowering. So when I am working with communities, I like to keep this in mind and that make sure it is truly collaborative and that they're not just a subject for my art. And then I also think about the audience and whose gaze is are we performing for? Okay, I hope that makes sense. Next, I'm going to tell you about 3 projects. I've done a lot of collaborative, socially engaged art projects, but I wanted to focus on sort of 3 that are very different from each other, but I feel like they sort of fall on a spectrum of socially engaged art practice, especially for people who are just starting off thinking about socially engaged art. There's loads of ways to do it, and I think that it's really exciting to see what people are doing. So Factory Trash, this is a critique of end-stage capitalism, and it's looking at the factory as a site of the sublime and the grotesque. And basically, I worked in a factory, and this project came about in terms of interactions with my coworkers, with my community in the factory, and thinking about how we live our lives in the factory. And so it was informed by the engagement with my community, with my coworkers, as well as the interaction between myself and the machines and the materials and the building itself. But it's not exactly collaborative, right? It's an individual, but I still feel that it's sort of on the spectrum of socially engaged art. And basically I created woven sort of vignettes of the factory. I took photographs of moments in space and time in the factory and translated them into weavings using the waste materials from the factory as a critique of end-stage capitalism. Next, this JID project, it's a collaboration with Yurika Higashikawa, who is my co-conspirator and fellow half Japanese artist. And we wanted to look at identity as a dialectic. And so we created, we had a series of sort of dialectical exchanges, and out of that we created instructional art pieces that we then shared and then performed each other's pieces as a continuation of that dialectic. And then through this sort of dialectic exchange, we created this idea of white gaze as panopticon. And the idea is that we're always performing racialized identity, and the white gaze serves as sort of like a surveillance and policing system for the performance of that identity. And then we took that and we did an artistic intervention. At this time last year, there were loads of sort of, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, there were loads of white art groups that were saying that they wanted to do better. They wanted to open up the space. And we were questioning, we were a little suspicious of this, and we were questioning, what does that look like when you're still in power, when you still own the space, when you're still judging the people that you say you want to bring in. And so we did an artistic intervention as in the form of an application to one of these open calls. We chose one of the open calls from Project Art Center, Haven, the Future Forecast Haven. And we essentially proposed, our proposal is a demand to resist and disrupt the white gaze. Essentially, we proposed a participatory art project that no white people would participate in, that was only for people of color and would only be viewed by people of color. And our question was, if people of color make art and no white people are there to witness it, is it still art? And we got our answer. We weren't expecting to get it because we realized that this was quite a radical proposal for given, the structures as they are. And we got rejected. So that was sort of like the culmination, what we expected from the piece. And then this last piece that I want to talk about is Embroidery Collective. And this is more sort of in the vein of the traditional kind of artists in the community, socially engaged art. Essentially, during COVID, everyone was trying to figure out ways to engage with socially engaged art practice, but in isolation. And so this was kind of a response to that. It's really, the way we thought of it is as a mutual aid project, essentially. So we sort of decided to do a kind of relay where we would embroider. None of us had, I probably had the most experience in embroidery as I'm a textile artist, but it's not my main practice. And so we all sort of became amateur embroiderers, and we used a single piece of cloth that we are still continuing to pass through the post to keep each other sort of connected, but also in isolation. A lot of people in the group were immunocompromised, and so we wanted to figure out ways that we could stay connected. Also, the group is specifically all migrants and ethnic minorities, and there's an extra layer of isolation in this group during COVID, because not only can they not travel out of their 5K, but also they're not going to be able to travel internationally to see their families anytime soon. So we have set up a way to become each other's families. We use the WhatsApp to check in with each other, and it's become way more than just embroidery. So, this is sort of, you can see the progress. I think the first stitches were made in August, and then it's still being passed. And we've learned a lot from the process. At first, none of us wanted to take up too much space. We were all doing our little pieces separately in the corner. And then we realized, actually, this belongs to all of us, and started trying to interact more. And now we're circling back and sending it again. And our plan is to make it replicable, but also scale it up and come up with other projects. So yeah, these are sort of all different projects, but all part of my larger practice. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Emily. We'll move straight on to Tobi. So Tobi Balogun is an artist based in Dublin and Carlow, working across dance, theatre, fashion and design. As a professional member of Dance Ireland and founding member of Human Collective Dance Company, Tobi has co-created many works for stage, including Fable for Dublin Fringe Festival in 2018, performed at Project Art Centre, and been nominated for a Best Ensemble Award. He has developed collaborative projects in association with choreographers Kathy Coughlin, Maria Nilsson-Waller, and with organisations such as South Dublin County Council, Tala Community Arts, Dublin City Council, and Dance Ireland. Tobi is the recipient of the Artist in the Community Scheme Bursary Award, Collaborative Arts and Human Rights, supported by Create the Arts Council and the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. Tobi intends to use the bursary as a time of research and critical reflection into delivering high-quality arts engagement to Black Irish communities and in expanding points of access for young adults who do not identify as professional artists, but have expressed a strong desire to engage with the sector and to examine the barriers for Black communities in establishing meaningful and ongoing engagement with the arts. So, Tobi, I'll hand over to you.
Hey guys, can everyone hear me okay? Awesome. Sorry. Yeah, so my name is Tobi. Yeah, so primarily for me, I think my practice is something I'm still shifting through or still trying to I guess have a set approach. And for me, I'm actually okay with that. So I primarily, just a little intro, been a dance artist the last few years, I guess, professionally, and on the side done a lot of my own fashion and design work. But I think due to BLM and lockdown last year, and also because I'm dealing with my own injury, I kind of felt the need to, I guess, relearn and redirect how it was that my work was carried on. So I'm just going to share my screen real quick. And today I'm just going to kind of bring you through a couple of kind of the projects that started off and talk you through some of the processes and what I've kind of found through them. So as I said, I've always kind of worked within the arts. It's more so within dance. But for myself, I think 2019 in BLM, I was noticing a lot of, although I was working a lot, I was still dealing with a lot of my own questions around race, identity, ethnicity. And also, both fortunately and unfortunately, I realized I was also always in a white space. I was never really close to a Black community. But what kicked it off for me was, so during BLM last year, we decided to, me and the friend of mine, Kingsley, decided to do a community-based performance piece where we wanted to have a kind of a response to what we were feeling from BLM. And during the process, we decided to, because for me, what I noticed was, although we always made a response to the traumatic negative experiences, it felt like there was never really never really a part of that response that highlighted who we were, reinforced for us our own experiences, our own identities, or at least kind of spoke about what it is we actually represent. So we did this two-part choreography piece. And the first part was, like I said, just a commentary on BLM, the situation, kind of trying to speak about those stereotypes we get painted with. And then the second part was more Afro-based and was more about representing where we were from, who we actually were, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the music we listen to. And this day for me is actually what kicked off a lot of my process. During the day, for the first time, I chose not to actually dance. I chose to direct the piece. And even for me on that day, just certain things I had to say to the crowd of, amazing young Black kids and young adults who are working with us on the day, certain things I had to say, certain ways in which we were viewed, made me kind of realize, although we were making a commentary on these things and trying to highlight these issues, it's kind of like the external view of what we were doing on the day was still the usual kind of prejudiced, not really paying attention to the nuance of what we were trying to portray. So I wanted to take time out of my own usual practice to explore what race and identity meant, how culture was treated in Ireland in terms of even words for me over the last few months, like ethnic and minority, which basically means not white, how we can, I guess, shift the view on these things, but also how a community could support itself, how a community could have better knowledge of access points. And I wanted to do this both within Irish arts and then also focus on looking at, how Black culture was affected globally within this, to then be able to bring it back into that space. So I've been on my bursary for the last couple of months. And what I wanted to do with the bursary was actually bring it back to a ground level and actually be really, as Emily was saying, be really interconnected with my community and kind of speak to everyone, see where everyone was at, kind of what support everyone needed. And over the last few months, what I've realized within my own practice that I felt I needed to do, also based on my own personal experience, because I find my work now is very, very influenced by my personal experience within race, identity, masculinity, all that kind of stuff. was, yeah, being able to have a proper network of supports, because what I feel is the best way to communicate these things, the best way to shift things is for the community's own perspective. So instead of, trying to have conversations about change for an external view, if the community was able to actually have its own response, but with the right set of supports and networks, be able to have, I guess, its own voice legitimized within the, I guess I would call it the white gaze or the industry's gaze. Because during a period of, I guess, kind of a social media overtake during BLM, I felt like things were being processed much quicker and being digested through visual and digital methods. So over the last few months, I kind of redirected myself from working in dance and fashion to trying to learn about, influencing culture, how to communicate certain things through film. I do feel when it comes to cultural integrity, there is a real need to have these communities, actually people who actually represent these different cultures, these different minorities, actually have them, I guess, protected in a sense and documented, so they speak for themselves as opposed to being spoken for and having to respond to that. Again, to repeat like what Jijo and Emily were saying, of people who are from cultural backgrounds having to make cultural work that only speaks about their identities and their traumas. So yeah, the last few months have been based on that, and kind of networking around that. So this Black is a piece, was the first piece that we filmed. It was produced and directed and choreographed by myself and this guy here, Kingsley. And yeah, on the day, I just realized, we have such a thriving community, not just of Black individuals of all sorts of nationalities. And it's like, I just felt like so many stories were overlooked. So many stories weren't being told. So many different perspectives were only being told from one particular approach. Like even for us within, I guess, the engagement of how people engage with our community, it still felt very one-sided in a way. And what I really wanted to do was work on trying to shift my arts work to be able to take that into consideration and also support that and provide that network of supports. So Black was the first piece we did. Leading on from this, I was able to work with Feli Speaks. And I'm going to play a little piece of this. Feli Speaks and Jafaris, who are two very well-known Irish artists, on a piece called Day, which is a film about race. And I'm just going to play like a minute of it real quick.
They tried to bury us. They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. They tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds with shoots. We came from lands rich in soil, we've got roots. They didn't know our people cannot be afraid of the dark they fear. Absorbing light to grow skin as thick as bark, as smooth as warm tarmac.
Today, my brothers and I march. Whips have formed hard wounds on our backs for far too long. My brothers and I can't see past hate whenever we meet our fate, at the hand of a man who can't see past shade. And for me, it's not him I hate. It's the notion or that belief that we as a people can't see our grace. And honestly, there'll never ever be home away from home unless we create our own.
Okay, so what I really feel is that I really feel like every form of art, everything I digest online for me is a socially engaged piece of work anyways, because for me nowadays, everything is based very much online, very much social media. So right now within my practice that I'm developing, I'm trying to look at how culture and, for me, because being Black and a dancer, I'm trying to look at how culture and dance or even identity can be communicated better and better affected and digested digitally and visually. So from They, which is a piece where I worked on the movement direction with Feli Speaks and Jafaris, it led me to want to study filmmaking, want to be able to portray my community better. And also, like I said, be able to offer that same network of support. So instead of the usual thing of, we have a response to something like BLM, then we go out, we have a community film piece. For me, if we had the right support, say if we had the film crew there, if we had someone within the community who was skilled within that, then we could actually better portray and have our I guess our voices more legitimized within the space where we're pushed down. So yeah, leading on from there, I applied for an internship with a UK-based production crew actually, and spent the last 8 weeks studying filmmaking. So I spent the last 8 weeks on different parts of filmmaking and networking and trying to build again that network for my community. But then ended up being brought into start reflecting on identity and social engagement in terms of masculinity and identity. And what I was focused on, so I'll just get this up, was trying to look within my project Black Canvas at, you know, not just my own views on identity and race, but my community's views, and trying to use, I guess, my voice and my platform to platform others who were othered like myself, who didn't really have the access to those supports. So this is just a quick, like a mashup. So for me, Black Canvas was a lot about bringing the conversation, beyond just like talks of identity and race and, you know, having to be a response to something all the time. I was like, what if the community itself spoke for itself, and then everyone, you know, had to listen to the community as opposed to the community having to have this thing happen to them and then respond to that. So I just spent a few weeks just gathering different I guess different codes, taking sound bites, actually like talking to individuals from my community, but also, like I said, using the network that I built during this process to then, after say speaking to each artist, use the network to support them, to platform them. And again, just trying to delve into our understanding of race and how to approach it, because I felt like it needed to shift to a more strategic point, and I didn't feel like we were within the process as well informed as we could have been. So yeah, so there was a few weeks of that, and then what I actually got to do, if I can just get to show you real quick, is I haven't actually shown this to anyone, but I got to produce this film, if I can find it real quick. 1 second. So this film is, for me, a reflection on Black masculinity and identity. But what I wanted to do was really try and challenge myself into trying to represent, I guess, multiple identities within Blackness, or I guess humanness. Because one thing that struck me within the entire conversation of social engagement with the Black culture is how, you know, quite often other ethnicities are othered under these labels. As Emily was saying, you know, it's like people who are, sorry, I'm in the coffee shop and really nervous, people who are settled white within the arts. I'm sitting in Costa and I'm like, I could say anything right now and be completely blitz. Yeah, people who are, say, I guess, settled white within the arts don't have to make work about identity, don't have to keep having to defend and reinforce for themselves, you know what I mean, who they are. And even within that reinforcement, for me, as I'll keep coming back to myself because that's just where I know best from as a Black person. It's like, you know, my friend Dylan, who's Black and Irish and mixed race, was born in Wexford, was like, you know, within the conversation of Blackness, he's like, you know how many Black guys can read off the history of slavery and yet can't even like give you a little bit of the history about where they're from. And it got me thinking. I was like, maybe the issue is that we're actually reinforcing for ourselves through the work, because we have to, because the space we live in, the same stereotypes, because that's all we're led to reinforce. Like when people invite an artist or an ethnic artist onto a show to speak about themselves, it's never really been about, okay, well, tell me who you are, tell me where you're from, show me your pride in, it's not about me being fixed within that, because even for me, I've grown up in Ireland, so I can't really say I'm fully from one place or another, but it's never been about reinforcing for those communities they're where they're at and what they believe in. It's always been, for me, about, hey, tell us what you go through. Tell us the terrible things, you know what I mean? So I was like, we're reinforcing these things. So what I really wanted to do was make a piece whereby, okay, well, everyone is cultured naturally. Everyone has their own experiences. Can we just highlight these in the most subtle manners? The same way I see culture consumed on TikTok, on Reels, on Instagram. Can I use these, and can my community subvert these same things without having to engage necessarily in the negative things and reinforce for itself who they are? So this is our response to that.
Oh, that's all. That's amazing. I must have your number stored on my phone as well. I'm like, what are you doing? We did everything. We did virtually everything. Yeah, through email and through, yeah. Yeah, so
Yeah, so within my, sorry, I'm just stop my share for a sec. So within my work, what I'm currently trying to explore is being able to actually highlight individuals from these different other communities and give them the space, the platform to use their experiences, their voice to communicate who they are and remind themselves of who they are. Because like I said, for me within, and I know I'm being very specific within what I'm discussing, but it's like within that conversation, it's like, yeah, there's only, as Emily said, there's only certain perspectives that are allowed to shine through, certain perspectives that are spoken about or discussed. And for me, I'm like, you know, can we use the arts as a support to address these things, to give these different communities the same level of the same level of access to supports that our white counterparts do? And can we take these labels off of these communities so that instead of me being in Ireland and people, you know, when they see me thinking of the word ethnic and minority, can they just see me as a person and actually want to, instead of othering me, want to actually get to learn about where I'm from? Can I, within my work, communicate and honor that also? And I do think it's really possible, even just through the support we're able to access. We're even being able to use music from back home, people from our community here. You know, I think, I think it's really possible to drive that change by being able to affect these things and allow that network of support to be used by these different artists. So that's kind of where where my work has gone through, and I just kind of wanted to touch on that because
Thank you so much, Toby. So much material in there. We'll pass on finally to William Bock before we have a chance to have a conversation and maybe unpack some of that material. So William is an interdisciplinary artist working in Ireland and the UK, exploring connections between people and the environments they inhabit. Collaboration and responsive approaches to working with materials, particular sites and with communities are central to his process. Land Walks, Land Talks, Landmarks was an Arts Council Artist in the Community funded project exploring a practice of walking, conversation and field recording to collaborate with people living in direct provision and local residents. William is a winner of the inaugural Sustainability First 2020 Art Prize, member of the Wilderness Art Collective, a founding member of artist group Dig Collective, producing projects commissioned by Art Sapiental Biennale for Land and Environment Art 2018 in Switzerland, Peer Gallery for Real Estates 2015 in London, and shortlisted for the Burns Sculpture Commission. William has produced projects for the Barbican and New Walsall Art Gallery in the UK and internationally, and his work has been published by the Dark Mountain Project Press, has featured in the Irish Times, RTE, Television, Lettres Internationales and London Review of Books. William is currently developing a participatory project on the banks of the River Shannon, commissioned by Ormston House. And we'll pass over to you, Will.
Thanks, Zoe. Hello, everyone. Great to hear about all your work. I'd like to take you on a little short journey through a recent project, the one that you were mentioning, Zoe, called Land Walks, which was a AIC scheme managed by Create, and it was funded in 2019 to 2020. It were over 6 months. I walked with individuals seeking asylum in Ireland and local residents, recording our conversations as we walked, together with the artist and composer Justin Grounds and artist Michael Holly. The group, our group, edited the recordings and created a sound score for others to listen to while walking in the same location. So they were mapped to specific sites where we walked. So I'll just share my screen. 1 second. So Landwalks as a project that evolved over 3 years through residencies at Uillinn West Cork Arts Centre and through engaging with the local communities of West Cork. I'm born in West Cork, but have family from a very mixed kind of cultural heritage in Europe. So I have a Jewish German background and a Swedish background. So although I was born in Ireland, I don't sound Irish, and my parents have, I suppose, connected me to kind of a wider cultural network. So, so in a way, this project was returning back to my birthplace and kind of understanding how the landscape sat now, what situation it's in, what was happening in the ecology and in the community. So a practice of walking helped me to make connections between the ecology of place, the natural ecology, the plants that grew there, and the increasing culturally diverse people who were living there. So the artist Uriel Erlo, who is an academic, has written a lot about this sort of relationship between sort of plants and people and migration. Talks about land as an archive of silent histories. So yeah, I suppose my practice is in walking is about exploring the outdoor landscape as a space to unearth stories about identity, belonging, and migration. Yeah, so yes, this is my father digging land when they moved there in the late 70s, and really this project kind of was a return. So this practice of walking, looking, engaging with the immediate environment around where I grew up. I lived in London for many years, so returning to Ireland was a connection to the rural Ireland that I knew. But I suppose the rediscovery of it, I've found certain stories connected to plants that were very pertinent to what I was exploring in the project. So the fuchsia flower, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, grows all around the hedgerows here in West Cork, and is kind of on every signage you'd see, jewellery everywhere made with that fuchsia flower. But it's actually a migrant plant. It's a plant from Peru that was imported to Europe in the 18th century, early 18th century. So a kind of a living reminder of a colonial past and of trade routes, of movement of goods. So this story of a plant that has a history, that has a story of movement was interesting to me, and I suppose I was keen to connect with people as well and see where the parallels sat. What were the differences? What were the similarities? Also, the Japanese knotweed is a plant that was placed in wealthy landlords' gardens around Ireland, and now has taken over and has kind of become demonized. So on one side, you've got the fuchsia flower, which is sort of lauded and considered to be beautiful and a native almost, and then the Japanese knotweed is a completely the other end of the spectrum. This is a knotweed whistle that I made. I can play you a quick little little here, so you can hear what it sounds like. I've got someone to play a kind of Irish. That was Bill Wright playing a jig. So sound is a very important aspect in my work, and it's become increasingly so. And so during these walks, I wanted to talk with people. So I met different people in the locality, and in the process, I was introduced to a community or a group of individuals who live in Clonakilty Lodge, the Direct Provision Centre here in West Cork, and set about a collaboration with individuals there with the support of West Cork Development Partnership, who helped me to introduce me to the individuals. Donna, the woman in the picture on the right, she knew everyone very well and worked with them intimately, so she knew kind of who would be into this kind of thing. And obviously Create Ireland were a massive part. They helped to fund the project, and then Uillinn West Cork Arts Centre. So it was these kind of key partners were really involved from quite early on, and definitely having done 3 residencies at Uillinn West Cork Arts Centre, this had kind of grounded me in the place, in the town, in a new way, for me anyway. But it gave me that footing to be able to kind of make connections with other organizations and try and to support funding. So what I was interested in doing is meeting a group of people who had a very different perspective of the landscape to maybe local Irish or even myself, who are new to that place, who'd come from very different cultural backgrounds. But I wanted the process to be collaborative from beginning to end, so that the process of recording was democratized. We as you can see, there's 2 of the participants. I basically gave the microphone to them, so it just changed the sort of power balance a bit, because I was coming in as an artist kind of wanting to do this exploration, but I also really wanted them to feel part of it and to have agency in that process. So the giving them the microphone suddenly took a certain level of power away. I mean, it's debatable. There's a lot of questions that came up as a result of those particular relationships, but I wanted them to feel that they were part of making this alongside me, and to learn the skills as well of sound recording. So we went on several walks, and there was a lot of discussion kind of prior to the walks and at the end, but sorry, it's taking a little while to load. The people in direct provision are going through a very difficult time and very complex time. They've got a lot of responsibilities. They've got children. So there was a lot of negotiation about, how much they could devote to this project. And yeah, it's something to bear in mind working with a group of people or a community like this. You're coming into a very particular environment that is quite unstable, and their lives are in a very uncertain place. So I was having to really, I suppose, learn on the ground, like how to collaborate with them, really, because they had limited time at one aspect of it. But there was a group that emerged from the process, and we started going on longer walks, and we met people en route. And what I started to realize is actually what was interesting was they started to ask other people questions. So it wasn't me asking them questions, but actually it was a sort of a kind of a catalyst for further conversations to take place. And also, for example, these 2 women who live in Clonakilty themselves and knew stories about this beach we were on, that gave them more information, more knowledge about where they were. One woman who came on this walk in particular, she said she didn't know there was a beach, and she was only 15 minutes away from it. So she was in awe. So there were different kind of revelations and learnings throughout the process. I then invited different people who, like local farmer. This is Michael Burke. He grew up in Lochain and knew all about the history and the stories and the poems about the area. So we walked up to the top of the hill, and he told us all about that. So there was the next stage was I suppose building the kind of sound world that we were going to integrate with the field recordings. So we worked with a musician, Justin Grounds, who again was another element in that process and helped us to kind of make the sound score really. So the walks manifested as sound pieces that were mapped directly to particular locations around Westcourt. I'll give you a short little snippet of it. I'm aware of our time being tight. Hope you can hear this.
My name is Mariam Abba. I'm from Sierra Leone. My favorite plant is cassava.
There is something in my village like that thing, like this long thing. We plant it and we call it tagboyo. We beat it after cutting it. When it dries like this, that means it's okay. When they cut it, they will beat it. They will clean it. It look like rice. And they will cook it. They call it tagboyo. This one. It look exactly like that when they plant it in our farms. I don't know if that's just a grass.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to see also.
Yes.
It's a reed. We call it reed.
Reed.
Yeah.
So bringing voices that maybe wouldn't normally be heard in that landscape was very interesting to me, and was quite a key element in the project, making voices audible where they weren't before. In a sense, I was interested in exploring the Irish landscape kind of as it is now, rather than as it's imagined. So, like, we are living with a really diverse group of citizens in Ireland, and I suppose that there's that danger as that diversity increases that we revert to old habits and kind of closed thinking. So I was interested in opening that thinking up and really presenting it as the diverse space that it is, with a very complex mix of cultures, but also of histories. So the sound recordings, the pressed plants, migrant plants, and other works kind of came together in land walks, land talks, landmarks, which was a combination of the land walks project, where you could go and walk the actual routes, you could hear them in the gallery, but also there was a forum of discussion for different community groups. And also, but unfortunately, COVID got in the way, to have our participants talk together. Vukasin Nedelevic, I can't pronounce his name, I'm really sorry, Vukasin, and Zoë O'Reilly ended up joining us for an online conversation as a result, because COVID stopping the exhibition. But in that, we talked and reflected on the process of walking, and Create helped to publish this book, which was a transcript of that conversation. So there were many different outputs from the process, and I think the participants were part of that process the whole way. And I mean, that was a new way of working for me, but I think really valuable. And some of those relationships are continuing to develop, and potential further collaborations take place with some of the members of the group. So I know it's been a long while, so I'll cut off there, and I'd love to chat to you a little bit more with you guys. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, William. And thank you so much to all of you for such interesting and diverse talks. I guess there's so many elements. I feel like there's so much material to unpack. So while you all have such diverse practices and ways of working and processes, what you have in common is that you work closely with or collaborate with various communities in Ireland, making visible or audible, in Will's case, kind of issues faced by them, or bringing them together so that they might create or speak in different ways. And I think that's come through really clearly in all the talks, that engagement and collaboration with people in different ways. What you also have in common is a background or identity, which might in very different ways for each of you be considered as other, or as a mixture of insider and outsider. And I think that's come through really strongly in all your talks. Emily and then Toby kind of specifically spoke about that idea of performing identity, which I think is a really important aspect to highlight, how artists who are seen as other are kind of expected to perform this or deal with issues in relation to this. And I think it can maybe be a hindrance to the work that's produced, perhaps, or a limitation. I was kind of wondering how, just slightly beyond that, how this identity of this mixture of insider and outsider affects how you work, or do you feel like it gives you a different perspective in a way on kind of communities in Ireland, or do people relate to you in a different way because of this insider outsider aspect of your identity? I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that briefly, and I know you've touched on it, all of you, in different ways, so you may not want to go back on it. Does anyone have any thoughts?
Insider, outsider. For me, that's always an interesting one. Very interesting dynamic. I see myself as an insider, outsider, pretty much in every situation, kind of depending on what angle it is. So I've been the dance artist, professional dance artist in Ireland, and that's also made me an outsider in some spaces within my own community, if that makes sense, because the creative field, in being, I guess, a Black creative in Europe, actually has me othered in so many different ways, both within my own, like even without my own family, whether they think it's like, something worth pursuing, or if it's, say, within even Human Collective, there's pieces we've done, and within those pieces, say the particular dynamic we've used seem like natural at first, and in my head I'm like, this isn't really considerate of, I guess, maybe my Blackness. And then I remember we performed a piece that we were researching called Blame Game, and within the piece and the process of the piece, there was a lot that I was, I guess, feeling like an outsider within my own group on. And then we performed it for Jonesy D from the UK, and Jonesy D was the one person in the room who was like, guys, you do realize this entire piece looks like a kind of a racial retelling of a particular dynamic. And I think within the group, I was the only one who would actually kind of taken note of that, if that makes sense. So it wasn't until we performed it that he said that the guys were like, oh, we never really noticed. So for me, being an insider and an outsider is always, I think it's always a constant. There was like a period when I was trying to think about, how to intersection these different disciplines. And then I read a quote by, I think it was Jordan Peterson, that was like, at the end of intersectionality, you get individuality. And that for me, I was kind of like, oop. It depends on what field you're in, really. And I think, I really do feel like you end up in that position regardless of what kind of space you're in. I think it's just a case of finding a way to work around our usual need for specificity and for people to fit a particular box and actually open up. And for me, the Creative Research School last autumn was amazing because we had a conversation. I think I was in a group with William and a few others, and Emily as well. and we had conversation about, you know, spaces being more open to allow for, I guess, a wider scope of identity, and for people to be able to be more than just one particular thing in that space, and how that would give a sense of freedom and also actually lessen the need for belonging to a particular system or identity. So I think inside or outside is something that's always gonna play up, and I just feel that perhaps it's because our society works so much on specificity. Everyone has to have a specific position, a specific this, a specific that. Maybe that's kind of what affects it, if that makes sense. Like, I was really happy to see Will showcase his work where he was walking with the women from direct provision and actually getting them to hold the mic, because I think it then makes you feel like that shift in power makes you feel like one of the insiders almost. And I really love seeing things like that, because that's something that's I guess a position that's not usually thrust on somebody who's considered an outsider within that particular field. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, so that's kind of where I stand on it.
Thanks, Toby.
Yeah.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to pitch in on that?
I'm going to jump in because my name was mentioned. Yeah, no, we were talking about the mongrel. Do you remember, Toby? Yeah, like the mongrel identity, like what, you know, the sort of the one that doesn't, the person who doesn't kind of fit into any category, any cultural kind of category, and the complexities of that as well, like, you know, what you put on the form. But yeah, like, just in terms of giving agency to, because you were talking, Toby, about, you know, handing the microphone over, and, you know, it's not just about giving people agency in that process, but also, like, I suppose, valuing people's knowledge. I think that's really, I mean, okay, it's not strictly, so it's not strictly about inside or outside, but it sort of covers that whole kind of territory of, like, what makes you part of something. And I think sometimes people's experience isn't always valued. You know, you have to be trained. You have to, I mean, as you were saying, Jijo, you know, there's, you know, if you don't have the money to get trained up in a particular industry, you know, where does that position you? You know, you're an outsider of the industry. But actually, we all hold a lot of knowledge, cultural or otherwise, which I think if it's explored in the right way can be really valuable and can be really insightful for yeah, just generally.
Emily.
Yeah, I think that I really appreciate that idea of, like, who has knowledge, who gives knowledge, and what this exchange looks like, because often there is, like, I am the artist going into a community, I am giving you this thing, right? This opportunity, this, my knowledge, my resources, whatever. But like, most of my practice is based on this idea of how textiles specifically are feminized and therefore devalued, right? Textiles are seen as women's work. Textiles are reproductive labor, they're domestic labor, and therefore undervalued. And I think that in some ways, community is outside of, like, the academy, it's outside of, like, the artistic sort of mainstream. And so that also gets into ideas and issues of reproductive labor, like reproducing society. And so sometimes socially engaged art is also undervalued. And so I think that it's really part of my thing about, like, art isn't activism isn't just about, like, no, this isn't good enough to be activism. It's more like, no, let's just value it for what it is. Like, let's reassign value. It doesn't have to be always, like, sexy and tough and macho and masculine, right? It can be soft and caring and supportive and concerned with community and process rather than just always outcome.
That actually led me to my next thought around activism, Emily. And you brought it up in your presentation, that distinction between activism or political organizing and socially engaged art. And I'm wondering how you all feel about this crossover in your work, because it's it comes across so strongly in all your work that the work you're doing is very activist in many ways, whether it's making visible issues or bringing people together. And I'm just wondering, do you see your role as an activist as well as an artist? Does that term kind of fit with you, or do you prefer to see them separately? And for anybody, any of you, because I think it's relevant to all of you.
Boom! Crushed again, second time. Woo! Just kidding. I really feel in this day and age, any kind of genuine art form is, in a sense, a form of activism. More so because, like I said, like we're in such a space of people consuming so much media that there's a particular stance that the majority pushed, if that makes sense. And then there's like all these other voices that kind of get covered up. And sometimes I feel like if you actually, when you make a piece of art that's genuine, like even nowadays, like has genuine cultural integrity, like if Emily was to make something that was genuinely about who she was, where she was from, without it having to pertain to a political stance on how she's viewed, if that makes sense. I think that within itself is a natural form of like rebelling against the system. And I do think it's also the most necessary way. Sometimes I feel like when responding to a political form of activism, you're almost kind of forced into this, again, like the call and response. And for me, it's like, say, even moments when we were on, I think, we had a few weeks ago, we were on RTE. There was like a panel that was discussing race and identity in Ireland. And we all kind of came off that panel, which was kind of more on a political basis in terms of what we deal with. And we all came off and everyone was kind of like, oh, that went really well, but we didn't really get to say what we felt we needed to say and da-da-da-da-da. And I was like, maybe that was because we were kind of fit into a particular political telling of what it is we want to speak about. Whereas if we'd been given the mic ourselves and got to, do the show, we could have actually spoken on particular nuances and particular points. And I really think trying to communicate those things now is it's sort of a natural form of activism. I'm like, okay, well, if you think I'm going through this, how do I tell you this instead? And yeah, I think that being tied into work, for me anyways, seems like the most natural way to move forward with activism. I don't really like to look at my work. I'm trying to take the word activism sometimes out of my work. I think it kind of makes communities almost feel like they have to act on something. Whereas if it's a case of giving the community its own voice, then the community can kind of uplift itself and reinforce for itself what it is that it believes in. And I do think also within the westernized idea of community sometimes, because back home, it's the case of, the older ones protect the younger ones, to bring them up. Whereas I think sometimes the westernized form of community is like you can have a community, but within that community, you have one person who's like the leader of the community. It's about that person offering opportunities for other people to activate something within it, as opposed to everyone kind of being able to interact and speak with each other. So I would say arts and activism kind of run hand in hand. Now, in nowadays, I don't think you really, especially with the way social media is on, I don't think you really have, in a sense, a choice, if that's a bad way to put it. But I think that just kind of comes around naturally. It's either you kind of roll with, like I can either join in with the Afro culture that's on TikTok, or I can choose to learn about Nigeria and do Afro that's traditional to me and makes me, learn more about my home place, if that makes sense. And I think that kind of has a natural activism for self within itself. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Toby. Jijo, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, well, I think my positionality is a little different from most of, let's say, second generation youngsters out there. I don't know, I never intended to be an activist by making these films. I think there is a way of, you get into something and then you turn out some product and then somebody tells you, okay, oh, this belongs there. That's what happened to me, because when I started making films, I never knew that I was practicing socially engaged art even, Only after 4 or 5 films, somebody told me, okay, you're practicing socially engaged art. So I went back and checked and kind of came to the realization, okay, there is activism in it as well, because I am positioning myself against the industry. Now, I didn't do it intentionally because I had no means and there was no producer. So I had to do my own DIY ways. And this is not just me. I know millions of filmmakers out there are doing this. But maybe they are not calling themselves activists either. They're just, they call us resource filmmakers. They write for whatever they have. They film with mobile cameras or whatever. So now when I looking back at my work and reviewing it, there is a lot of, activist element in it. There is bringing visibility to my community, and there is a lot of my thematics is always dealing with some kind of criticizing my own community for this or that. So that is a kind of activism within my community as, let's say, as an outsider, looking at my community as an outsider and seeing that, okay, you are being too ethnocentric, too religious, you have to get out and integrate, all my messages are that. That's another sort of activism. But I wouldn't dare say that I am as activistic as, let's say, Emily or Tobi or William. And filmmaking itself is an art form which is, I would say, in many ways, you can't break out of that form and be too experimental because the format is, it restricts you in many ways other than, I don't know, now William invented a new art form like the land walks, we cannot do much with filmmaking like that. I feel like, yeah, that's my...
Thanks, Jijo. Emily, can I come in there?
Yeah, I guess I make the distinction also between activism and political organizing, right? And so like organizing means that you're getting people together to create movements essentially for social change. Whereas I think activism is, if you do something, then that can be activism. Where I would say that there is a distinction, or for me, where the distinction is meaningful, is that political organizing speaks back to a larger strategy, and art does not, or it doesn't have to. Do you know what I mean? And it's fine that it doesn't, but I do think that sometimes we're quick to be like, oh, well, my activism is my art, so then I don't really have to do anything, and like that's going to change the world. And like, good luck, like fair play. But I also think that like sometimes we need to value things for what they are. And also I think where it becomes dangerous is when people sort of, I think artists are expected to sort of jump on a topical issue because that's where funding is, or, that's sort of going to get them a platform or something like this, but they don't necessarily have a lot of understanding of that political issue or the nuances of the political issue. And then that can be really damaging actually, because it can do harm to the movement who has been engaged on these issues, who might not have the same platform that an artist might have. So for me, it's an important distinction.
Thanks, Emily. Will, do you have any thoughts on that? You don't have to be put under pressure.
Hi. No, I don't feel under pressure. I relate to you, Tobi. Just I don't see my work as activism. I think there's something to be said. I suppose the driving force in me working kind of on the ground in a very kind of tactile way with people. I suppose. Sorry, I'm going back. Basically, there's like two major things in my mind that are going on in Ireland at the moment, and one is obviously the environmental crisis that's sort of global, but I'm seeing certain things down here in West Cork that are changing, not just environmentally, but how the land is treated. And then there's the other aspect of this increased migration, more people coming to the country, which is a great thing. And and in some ways I'm trying to sort of see where the two connect, and if they do, and how they do, and that sort of sense of engaging with place in a very direct way, outside of social media, outside of mediated situations, for me, I think is a way in to talk about something political, but it isn't. Yeah, it isn't overtly a political thing, and I wouldn't want to get. Yeah, I mean, I agree, Emily. I'm not. I am kind of. I'm bypassing that label, but I think it does feed into a bigger conversation. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, also, I don't want my art to be activism. Like, I do enough of that, you know, like I want to be able to just make art and that be okay.
Yeah, and that's a really important point as well, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just to shift slightly away from that, I'm interested in because you will work so closely with people in different ways, how this year has affected how you work. Emily, you touched on that with the Embroidery Collective as a way of dealing with that isolation, but being together and working together. I'm just wondering if the others have any thoughts as well on how your work has had to adapt. Has it had to adapt? Have you had to think of kind of new ways of working with the people you previously collaborated with, or with new collaborations that are starting? Have you had to adapt those methods from the ways you would usually work? Anyone wants to jump in?
Start time running. Boom.
Yeah, I mean,
Tobi.
Go for it, Tobi, if you want to. Don't mind.
Will, you go first this time then. Go, Will, and then we'll come to Tobi.
Yeah, no, on a sort of immediate, I suppose, response, you know, because the exhibition only lasted for 2 weeks instead of the month. And there was a lot of events that were going to happen as part of it for that project. That went online. You know, the participants, we spoke online, and then eventually a publication was produced. So that was really interesting, and I'd never worked in that way, sort of translating a kind of live mediated event into a kind of tangible object. I thought that was a really interesting process to go on. But I also think it was a time for me to take stock a bit, because I've been quite deeply ingrained in this sort of work for a while, and it actually was quite welcome to have a bit of space to kind of recalibrate a bit and reflect on what had been done. And actually now that things have opened up again, I'm kind of recontacting some of the members, and we're talking again, and we're like seeing, you know, what the next steps could be, so that it feels like it hasn't finished things, that you know, the lockdown didn't kind of cut things off, but there was that space in time that you know, I found quite valuable, but it was more of a personal time, I'd say.
Yeah, okay, great, thanks, Will. Jijo?
Jijo. Okay. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I just I'm still finishing a film, and I haven't produced the last, final cut yet, so still editing. And the last 6 months I've been in a collaboration with 5 different artists who are living all over the country. So actually this was, being able to meet online and collaborate online was a blessing for us, because otherwise 2 of them are in Cork, 1 of them is in Galway, and there's no way we can meet every week. And we met every week, and it was a full-on collaboration, I would say, because otherwise I would be meeting these people in a room, but those meetings were limited. Within 6 months, maybe, I don't know how many hours, but this one was every week meeting, every week 1 hour, every week discussions, and then they will produce their own video, they will send it over to me. I think I can make a film online now, and I feel so confident that, even meeting nobody, I can make a film with people living in States and New Zealand or whatever. I think these COVID brought us to a new, for me, it was a revelation of, online filmmaking or online collaboration between different artists have been already happening. But it was a first experience for me. And we were lucky that the restrictions eased and I've been able to travel to go and Cork and film them. But even without that, we could have produced a film. We were almost very close to producing a film. Me never ever meeting these collaborators. So I would say COVID opened up new possibilities for me.
There are positive aspects. Tobi, man.
Yeah, I would say the same. I think COVID for me completely changed how I work. I'm used to just like dancing. So I'll go teach my class, I'll have a performance, I'll have a rehearsal, but COVID really put me to begin with in a space whereby I couldn't do any of those things. So I had to sort of review, and I've pretty much spent the last few months like just traveling, networking, doing online, a lot of online sessions. And it's really allowed me to build a lot of networks. Like I've been able to meet a lot of different people, collaborate with a lot of different people, same as the guys I've never been able to before. Like while trying to learn more about filmmaking and directing, I actually got to network with a lot of filmmakers and then also learn from them, run like organized projects online with them whereby we could meet for a day. Like even the film I played earlier on, we literally like would organize for weeks online, meet for the day, everyone knows the plan. Cool, whatever happens in that moment is like the right thing to happen. And although it felt like, maybe things aren't as ready as they usually would be, it also felt so right in that we were able to really have the space to bring, I think, a different kind of depth to each situation. And then on top of this, it also actually, I think for me, I underestimated, I underestimated everything being brought online. I ended up like planning too much and having a little bit too much to do. But it did really allow, like I was able to, I spent the first 3 months from September to December, like in London on an internship with my mentor. And I was in a room by myself, but I was able to call, for the first time in my life, I was calling my community every day. So different guys I was speaking to. And it's actually what led me to certain reflections on like masculinity and mental health, because we were able to talk on the daily and actually monitor each other's mental health and where each other was at. And that's actually how we got to connect better as a community. I think otherwise it would have been like a case of me trying to run Black Canvas as a symposium as it originally was supposed to be about race. And because nothing could happen in person, it felt very distant. But at the same time, I think it gave a real space for things to actually become more, to be able to be more interrogated, to be able to be more discussed, better informed. And then I think even just the spontaneous projects that came together on the day had a better depth to them, if that makes sense. And also primarily, it led me from trying to, I guess, manage my projects on social media to actually trying to build a website. And within the website, what I wound up focusing on was, although I was presenting my work, trying to use it as a way of highlighting all the different people I'd worked with and the communities and make sure everybody was really spoken for and seen through that as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Tobi. Emily, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, my husband died of COVID, so it's been a difficult year. But, in terms of my practice, it's completely changed my practice. I think it's changed loads of people's practice, but just because I just wasn't able to function at the same sort of pace that capitalism forces us to function at, even as artists. Even as artists critiquing capitalism, we still are forced through funding cycles that are based on capitalist funding sources to work at this pace. And I wasn't able. And it was really good for me, for my practice, to slow down and take the time to reevaluate what is actually important, what does my practice look like now, and really build care work into my practice and figure out ways of valuing that. So yeah, that's it.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, you mentioned among that the kind of funding cycles and applications and its effect on work and on the pace of work. and it was something I wanted to come to. Was Jijo, you mentioned in your presentation being invisible and unaware of funding structures for such a long time. I'm wondering how you, this is for all of you, but how, Jijo, to start with, how you kind of became aware of funding structures and that you might be eligible for them, and how that affected your work and your journey with that.
Yeah, well, as Emily said, once you start to get funding, you get pressured by these capitalist forces to keep on working and working. I was very happy making my own films at my own pace. Anyway, I think 2 of my films were shown in a film festival here in Ireland, and a director happened to see it, and he contacted me and asked me to go to Create, and I thought, okay, who's Create? What is Create? I never had. We were not even aware of Arts Council or funding or nothing, and this is nothing new, because at the moment I worked with an artist, a Zimbabwean musician. He's just out of DP last 6 months, and when I went to him and we talked about funding, and he's like, "You get money from the government? Really?" You see, that is a position of most of us who come here, who is not aware or who is not used to this kind of funding back home. And I got guided, and then I went to Create, and Create guided me through all the process, and then I got kind of hang of it, and I started applying and getting a lot of money. But I should say that I feel that what Emily said, I'm not very good with deadline stuff, and these pressures on you to produce something within a deadline is not helping me a lot. So I'm very cautious with applications. I want a lot of time, and I make sure, especially I'm a full-time worker as well, so I make sure that I have only one project at a time, and it has plenty of time for me to spend on it. So that's where I am.
Yeah. Thanks, Jijo. Will, you spoke about land walks as a kind of coming back to your place of birth in a way, and I'm wondering how, when you came to start that project and your other work in Ireland, like your kind of journey with funding and support for that work. Can you give us a little sense of that?
Yeah, I felt very organic. Equally, like usual, I wasn't really aware of what was available to me, and it was only through doing the residencies over a few years, sort of, a month or 2 at a time, that I started meeting people and talking about the work and making connections with local organizations. And it was only a few years that I heard about Create even, so which I feel like is family now. Like I really connect with all that they stand for. But I hadn't been aware of them. So it was kind of a knock-on effect in a way. It was like or a domino effect. Once I kind of established one connection, then I could talk to someone else and say, well, I'm getting this from them, would you support? And that sort of grown, and that's my experience anyway.
Thanks. Emily, what's your journey been on that? How have you found support for the work you do?
Yeah, Create has been great in supporting the work. I think, I don't know. I think that I've had sort of a struggle in terms of how I want to present my work, because I felt for a long time like I had to perform this identity, right? This like cultural diversity identity. And it didn't feel great, to be honest, because I felt like, my work was one thing, but then how I was presenting it in order to get funding, because I kind of knew like the people on the panel will be probably all white and settled and Irish, and they'll probably think that this sounds cool and exotic, right? I kind of played that part up, even though it didn't feel good. It didn't feel like honest, really. And so I made a conscious decision not to do that. And I have maybe gotten less funding because of that conscious decision, but I've also gotten funding for things that I feel very proud of. And so yeah, I think that's a thing that I struggle with, also in terms of how to sort of distribute that knowledge. And I think Create are very good with that, with meeting with people, letting people know what funding is available. Not all sort of arts grants are like that. And a lot of times they're very heavily gatekept. And especially if you're not from Ireland, it can be really sort of disorienting to come in and try and figure out how to access funding, but also how to like prove that you're an artist outside of a context of the Irish art scene.
Emily, would you, and this I want to kind of put this to everyone as a sort of final, and I'll come to you, Toby, about your sort of funding journey, but Emily, would you have any advice to somebody starting out in a socially engaged arts context in Ireland who's kind of looking for ways to find support for their work? What would you advise them to do or think of?
I would advise them to talk to Create, like genuinely. People are really generous with their time and really rooting for you, which is great. And I think also, if you know people who have been funded, ask them for their funding applications and see what they've said and what's gotten funded as well. I think as artists, we kind of end up competing with each other in this way that doesn't feel natural or good. And I think it would be I would love to see, I know there's an artist union that I'm a member of, Praxis, but I'd love to see more people sharing resources with each other and working cooperatively rather than competitively.
Thanks, Emily. Toby, the same question to you in terms of advice, and also giving us a little sense of your funding journey and how you found support for your evolving work.
My funding journey personally didn't really begin till last August after the Black and Afro video. And that was actually my mentor, Kathy, who'd worked with us with Human Collective for years, going, oh, this piece of work is amazing. How can we make the change? How can we actually help affect the change? And from there, she actually guided me through a professional development award application. And then I was blessed that through that and through speaking with Louise from Dance Ireland, I was put in contact with Anya from Create, actually. I got to take part in the research school. And then after that, I've found Create, like everyone else has said, so above and beyond. Like even before I've gone to look for applications, or while I'm looking for applications, Create would also bring opportunities and other applications that might suit to my attention as well. And I've just found them. Yeah, found Create and the whole team such a huge help. I do want to add in that the same thing as Emily. I think the sharing of knowledge of what support's available, what applications are there, and also how to process an application needs to be more kind of across the board. I think I would agree with Emily in that I think it's still quite protected in a sense. Now, for me, I found a bit of frustration in I think as a Black or ethnic artist, not knowing that the funding exists there normally is one thing. But then I think outside of say the funding and applying for funding and the schemes, because there's a lot of different ones there. Sometimes trying to fit some funding schemes, trying to fit the identity of the work you're trying to do, or the feeling or the effect you're trying to get from the work into that particular funding stream can be quite difficult. And I do also feel that at points I found it a bit over intellectualized, if that makes sense. Like the language, like for me, I'm lucky to have spent the last 5 years not lucky, stop calling it luck, working within the arts and trying to do my best to learn, and particularly last year. But I'm like, for a younger artist starting out, the language would be a huge barrier. I know even there's a Irish girl called Jessie who we train together all the time. I give her a lot of advice, and I remember for her one of the information sessions, she messaged me being like, yo, my head is absolutely spinning from from the language being used. And this was an Irish, an Irish artist. So I was like, for me, trying to inform, say, the younger Black artists who are now interested in these funding streams about it, they're all coming back to me, and I'm like, the language for them is like a barrier. It's like the formatting, the particular specifics. So I do think there's a lot to work around that. And for me, just to finish, I would say having an organization like Create There has been a huge support within funding. Even for the people I've spoken to within my bursary, I've to then be able to bring them back to Create and have Create advise them has been a hugely monumental thing. And for me, it's made me want to disconnect as much from looking at even the Arts Council funding streams as much, because I find they can be quite cathartic and also, again, just not very helpful information-wise.
Thanks, Toby. William, did you want to come in there with any last piece of advice?
Yeah, just very quickly, just I think a hybrid approach as well is good. So not like holding off on your project until you get Arts Council funding, go for it, do it. There'll be local funding, find out about, the local council, but also like maybe local organizations. Like I have West Cork Development Partnership, which works a lot with, people with social needs. There's a lot of stuff out there beyond just sort of formal art, sort of national arts funding. And I think it's actually will boost your application to have those, or before you go for the maybe big amounts. And just think outside the box, find money from from different places. Even crowdfunding is possible depending on what you're doing. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Sorry, muted. Thanks, Will. And Jijo, any last words of advice?
I would just agree with whatever Emily and William said, and I agree with both the parts. You Create is a good starting point. They will guide you from there. And as William said, if there is any filmmakers out there who are trying to make films, try to make films on your own if possible, because unless you have a producer, you have already found a producer, or there is this what I call a field of filmmaking, which is called resource filmmaking, where you can, now everything is available. We can make a film on a mobile camera even. So filmmaking is very accessible to anybody. It's not. You don't need to get into the industry and do it. You can stay outside the industry and still do it without any money at all. There are a lot of tutorials out there how to do that. So that'd be my 2 cents.
Thank you, Jijo. And thank you to all of you for your contributions, for sharing your work, for your time. I'd say we've gone way over time with a really interesting conversation, but thank you. That was really a pleasure to be part of that conversation.